Hello and welcome to yet another installment of the history of Battlefield. Today we'll be leaving the world of personal computers and venture out into the realm of console gaming with Battlefield 2 Modern Combat. And just for the record, I'm not a very good console player, especially when it comes to first-person shooters. That's why you won't see the pinpoint accuracy you are used to on this channel. Oof, fat chance. The spin-off game Battlefield 2 Modern Combat is the fourth installment in the Battlefield franchise, and the first one that was made exclusively for consoles. The game was released in October of 2005 for Xbox and PS2. The Xbox 360 and PS3 release came out in April of the following year. Originally scheduled to be released 1 year earlier, the game became a huge success for EA nonetheless. The additional time given to development may have been a contributing factor. EA and DICE must have noticed while developing the game that even if the console supported online multiplayer, a sizable amount of the player base didn't have access to the internet, and couch co-op was played way more often than multiplayer on consoles back then. It was the time when a lot of people declared consoles to be the future of gaming, declaring the PC to be dead. They were dead wrong. Even if consoles were declared to be the future, EA approached this game like a PC multiplayer shooter, until realizing the big fact of missing internet connectivity. Even if you had internet at home, and even if you had a spare LAN cable to reach your PlayStation, then I need to refresh your memory on something. The most successful console back then, the PS2, didn't even come out with network connectivity out of the box. Yes, you had to purchase an extra LAN card for your PlayStation. So they pushed back the release and hastily created a single-player campaign, something you often notice when playing the rather boring campaign. It was all quickly cobbled together. But before we go into gameplay and multiplayer, we'll address the technique behind the game. Contrary to Battlefield 2 on the PC, Modern Combat doesn't use the Refractor 2 engine, but uses the Renderware engine, an engine that was developed by a company called Criterion Software, a British developer that most players know as Criterion Games, famous for games like the Burnout series. Why DICE decided to choose this engine isn't really clear. I couldn't find hard evidence in my research. I assume that DICE couldn't bring the Refractor 2 engine to work properly on the hardware of the old console generation. If you remember, the Refractor 2 engine was very demanding for the time. The Renderware engine, on the other hand, was optimized for PS2 hardware, and since it was quite difficult to program for this console, I think that was the reason for choosing this engine. But the decision didn't work out too well for the owners of the original Xbox and PS2, since the game looked completely terrible. That's no statement on how fun the game was to play, it was merely not too pleasant to look at. But luckily, the game came out for the newer consoles roughly half a year later.
We've made much greater use of dynamic lighting, and this too can make a real difference to gameplay, as the player's muzzle flash gives his position away in the dark, and explosions and things like that light up the world. Damage and effects they're another area that have been given a major overhaul. Things like shooting up surfaces now reveal what they're made of, with really deep craters, and
But even on my Xbox 360 Slim, I had some framerate drops when there was too much action on the screen. I suppose the lack of experience and knowledge with the new hardware, and also the inexperience on DICE's part regarding single player and consoles in general, is the reason for the problems. For this video I played the PS2 and Xbox version, but I've recorded most of the footage on a borrowed Xbox One X, which didn't have framerate problems due to the superior hardware, but I had a strange bug. If I restarted the mission, it got darker and darker with every minute. A bug that could only be fixed when going back to the main menu and restarting the entire mission completely. Slightly annoying, but nothing game-breaking, and strangely the bug didn't occur on my Xbox 360 or PS2. But that was one of the smaller issues I encountered with this game. Battlefield 2 was the first Battlefield game with a single-player campaign, featuring 19 missions, with a pretty simplistic story. We are talking about a console game that is approaching a 15th anniversary, and come from a perspective of a time in which games and the companies producing them have massively changed. So maybe my standards are a bit too high by now, or they were way too low back then, because I remember enjoying it when it came out, but when I revisited it a few years later, I was underwhelmed. As we said before, the story is boring and generic as hell. NATO and China are fighting against each other because of some stuff that happened in Kazakhstan.
ex-Russian satellites have rebelled, and the most crucial, Kazakhstan, is the centerpiece of a fast-moving confrontation.
Both sides blame each other like children. You are the bad guys! No you! No you! No you! No you! In the end, it is revealed that a secret terror organization called the Burning Flag caused all the trouble and tried to bring the two forces to nuke each other, so that they could rule the world, because there would be no one else to stop them. For this scenario to work, you would have to forget about the whole rest of the world, and that's exactly what they did. Like, Russia was forgotten about as a direct neighbor of Kazakhstan. Modern Combat is, by the way, the only mainline Battlefield game not to feature the Russians. Most of the narrative is being delivered by video sequences with a speaker introducing you to the current situation, while the game loads the next level in the background. In addition, you sometimes get small render sequences at the end of a mission.
This is a signals intel mission designed to destroy their ability to communicate electronically. We'll do it with a rapid raid, and the primary asset will be a comm technician who will arrive at each site via helo.
This delivery method manages to fail spectacularly at times. More than once, I didn't even realize which side I was fighting for. The game shuffles around the protagonists from mission to mission. In one mission you play on the side of the NATO forces, and in the next mission you will play on the side of the People's Republic of China. But it is all inconsequential, as it doesn't affect the story or gameplay at all. Most of the missions play out like this: go to a place, kill all enemies, place some C4, or worst, go to a place and take some pictures. Granted, a lot of FPS games have similar objectives, but they know how to hide it, or rather stage it, better. DICE introduced a feature enabling you to switch between friendly soldiers with the press of a button. I assume to create a battlefield feeling, but that attempt fell flat on its face, at least if it was an attempt to emulate the multiplayer atmosphere. Every soldier is a grunt, a random soldier, no face, no character, nothing remarkable. Well, that's the same as in multiplayer, but it doesn't really serve the attempt of creating a narrative-driven story. That is nothing bad in itself, many games did it this way. One of the best examples would be Call of Duty. I don't know any soldier from the first two Call of Duty games, with the exception of, I guess, Captain Price. But Infinity Ward knew how to create an impressive and almost cinematic campaign. I still remember the mission in Call of Duty 2 where you play the Russians and have to defend a building as they come at you screaming through the great-looking fog. Even generic settings like a beach landing were memorable moments. Sure, some would say Call of Duty uses movies like Band of Brothers or Saving Private Ryan as inspiration, and why not use great movies as material to lean on for your story? A modern equivalence for Battlefield did exist, several actually. So how about Black Hawk Down?
RPG!
My men are surrounded by thousands of Somali militia. I need help now.
What I want to say is, if you create a single player, you have two big choices. Give us characters we care about, or give us some action-filled madness. DICE managed to give us none of those. The campaign is boring and uninteresting. It is something quickly cobbled together to provide a selling point for people without internet connections, which at the time was a sizable demographic. Modern Combat's single-player campaign is an array of glorified bot matches, instead of a narrative-driven campaign that engages you for several hours and leaves a memorable impression. But enough with the negatives, let's look at some positive factors. As we mentioned before, you can switch in between soldiers on the ground with the press of a button, giving you the ability to fulfill multiple roles on the battlefield. You have infantry approaching over the hill? No problem. Switch to the assault class and take them out with a grenade launcher. Heavy armor is advancing rapidly on your position? Not for long when you switch to the engineer and crack those boxes open with an explosive can opener. Facing snipers giving you a hard time? How about some counter-sniper action? Well, you catch my drift. You are very flexible. Some missions heavily rely on this feature. You need to switch in between classes, otherwise some missions become really hard. The game doesn't constantly tell you to switch around, something that I really like. They force you to experiment and think for yourself. And even though the sledgehammer method works and you are able to force your way through with only one class, it is a rather frustrating and time-consuming method. A little example. In one mission you have to place C4 charges on a bridge that is heavily defended by soldiers and even a helicopter. You begin the mission with a Spec Ops soldier. Sure, you can shoot hundreds of bullets at the chopper and die dozens of times fighting your way through the enemy soldiers on the bridge, or you swap to a sniper, call in a missile strike to kill the chopper with one easy hit and shoot the soldiers with your sniper rifle. This feature provides the game with some potential for replayability. This is pretty sandboxy and gives you a level of freedom that I miss in many other games. But that's pretty much where the fun part stops. They don't tell you how many respawns you have. You figure that out after every NPC in your team is dead and the mission is lost. Furthermore, you cannot choose the type of soldiers in your team that you take with you into battle. You're going to fly a chopper which needs repair? Okay, here's a dozen Spec Ops soldiers, instead of engineers. Or you are on a really gigantic open map, so take the engineer and enjoy your shotgun, which is going to be of great help on a vast open plain. The ability to pick specific teammates for the mission would have made the game a lot more fun and a lot more interesting, and to add insult to injury, the AI friends that you have are incredibly brain dead. The pathfinding is horrible too, especially for vehicles. Even just small obstacles usually prove too much to handle for the AI. The concept of driving around something is often foreign to them. But that is something I can live with. I've seen worse in this very game. Like the enemy's ability to see and shoot you through cover. I'm not bothered by the fact that they can shoot through things like a tent, because camping gear is not necessarily known for bullet-stopping abilities. What really grinds my gears is their magic skill of shooting you through solid rocks, walls and sandbags. It kind of takes you out of the immersion when the bots that usually have the tactical awareness of a squashed tomato all of a sudden display a level of marksmanship that makes the best ESL players pale in comparison. Considering all this, in combination with a useless damage marker, I got overwhelmed many times. Cover was basically useless, the damage marker misdirects you more than often, and you are unable to heal yourself, and of course, a medic is never in sight. But let us move on to level design. It is standard Battlefield stuff, slightly adapted for single-player objectives. Sadly, the playtesting came up short. You have annoying segments of endlessly spawning opponents until you pass a certain trigger, and also NPCs spawning behind you. You engage the enemy, get killed, swap to the next soldier of your team that is behind you, and you pass the old trigger, which you have already passed with the previous soldier, and there's the enemy behind you again, that has already spawned behind you, but the trigger works every time you walk past it. It is pretty obvious that DICE didn't playtest the game enough. Even in the design of the map geometry you notice a lack of playtesting and polishing. You often see stuff not placed correctly, like a metal catwalk that isn't aligned properly. Sometimes you see floating props like rocks and vegetation. These things happen, of course, but it is a habit with this game. It is a bit frustrating from a design perspective. Overall, the graphics are quite well. They don't look bad or outstanding for the time. It was pretty regular stuff for the later consoles. The initial version for the older console generation was lacking in the visual department though. There's an old trick that is sometimes used to boost performance, disguising a low draw distance with atmospheric fog. In this game you have something similar. Maybe not fully obscuring the world, but you do have a noticeable zone around you in which the world is drawn brighter and more detailed. It's like a ship's bow wave around you. And speaking of a low draw distance, this isn't such a prevalent issue with this engine. However, they did not manage to disguise the edges of the map in a visually pleasing manner. At some point you just hit a very unnatural end of the world. In earlier games they managed to do this a lot better. At least they stop you from falling down. Or do they? The game's animations are practical. The view models are mostly animated competently. I just remember that DICE used some wrong animations for a few guns. For example, the Chinese sniper is a semi-automatic rifle, but after every shot he loads the gun. And you can fire most of your weapons while still in the drawing animation, which is a little weird. Where the animation department did somewhat of a lackluster job is when it comes to event animations. Some mission set pieces look terrible. One of the worst offenders was where you have to blow up a submarine. I bet they made this animation in 5 minutes, or gave the job to the trainee. You know, obviously being hyperbolic here, but you know what I mean. The game's ragdolls are mostly comical in typical Battlefield fashion, and are fine. The particle effects look, well, like you would expect them to look on a console in 2006. Something I think is worth mentioning in a positive way is that DICE didn't just copy all of the assets from Battlefield 2 for Battlefield Modern Combat. They also created new ones for this console game exclusively. Some vehicles like the BMP-2 or the Leopard 2, which weren't featured in the vanilla Battlefield 2. The Leopard 2 was later introduced to the computer with the European Forces add-on for Battlefield 2. Also, the wrench tool was replaced with a power tool, and the Carl Gustav, the most beloved rocket launcher in Battlefield Bad Company 2, made its Battlefield debut in this game. Besides mostly looking fine, a game has to sound good as well. While the game does nothing revolutionary, it does manage to create a dense sound atmosphere. But I guess that's something the Battlefield games never failed at. The music was there, but not memorable. Certainly nothing to get stuck in your head like the original soundtrack. The single-player soundtrack was made by Rupert Gregson, and the multiplayer score by Tobias Marberger. And now a few words about the German synchronization. It's okay, I guess, not impressive. And I suspect there are a few translation errors. For some reason everyone is constantly shouting. Even if there's no enemy around, they are screaming like the soldiers on Omaha Beach, as seen in Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. More than often, the commands being yelled around by the soldiers don't even fit the situation, which is a bit annoying and sometimes comical. And just calm the fuck down, guys. The gameplay wasn't too heavily modified for the single player, although there are some specialities here and there. The game introduced us to a point system. You get points for every kill, and if you kill several enemies in a row, you get a combo meter, reaching ridiculously high scores, to the likes of an Asian fighting game. Points way beyond 100,000 are nothing unusual. During a mission you get bonuses for these points, like temporary upgrades to your soldier. The first one I came across was health, which basically upgrades your health a little. Later boosts include faster movement, really useful since there's no sprinting in this game, faster reload, more damage, armor, and so on, turning you effectively into a super soldier. And the moment I became the Uber Soldier, I had admittedly a lot of fun mowing down dozens of enemies without any problems. I managed to get the full boost combination only at one point during the entire single player, and sadly that was during one of the worst missions. Yet, feeling like John Rambo admittedly made that mission a lot more fun, but it really messed up the Battlefield feeling. Temporary stat buffs are really nothing that fits into a Battlefield game. And if DICE was going for the Battlefield feeling in the single player, then they failed. With points earned during missions, you also unlock new gadgets for your soldiers. But the game chooses to unlock them for you, unlike in the original Battlefield 2 for PC, where you had the freedom to choose for yourself. So if you want a specific gadget, you have to wait until the game gives it to you. Some gadgets are more or less pointless. A 45-round magazine is nice, I guess, but the unlockable smoke grenades are rendered completely useless with the AI's ability to see right through them. The knife you can unlock is also impractical, because there's no situation where you come close enough to an enemy and survive to strike them down, at least in the single-player missions I played. Maybe it is also due to the fact that I rarely choose to switch my weapons due to the controls. The game generally suffers from issues many console adaptations of classic PC shooters have. A controller is just a lot more limited than a mouse and keyboard. Maybe that is the reason why the sprinting function was removed. And as an additional little annoyance, remapping the controller is also impossible. Sadly, I have to come to the conclusion that the campaign for Battlefield 2 Modern Combat isn't good or worth mentioning. Boring storytelling, no memorable characters, and the entire gameplay doesn't work properly for Battlefield. It's not worth the money or the time, even for the extra missions that you unlock with some challenges. Ultimately, I have to come to the conclusion that Battlefield 2 Modern Combat was largely a disappointment. I feel bad for the console players from back in the day. Even though I played it too on my PlayStation, I don't consider myself one of the unhappy ones who had to stick to the console version. I could switch to the PC anytime, something a few of my friends envied me for, and were happy once they got a proper gaming PC as well. I can't get around the feeling that EA fooled a lot of players. The name Battlefield just promises something bigger than the game that was actually delivered. In this video we largely focused on the single player aspect of this game. The official servers are long gone, and getting the game to run multiplayer nowadays is rather laborious. Props to the people who keep the multiplayer alive. So for my verdict of the multiplayer action, I have to rely on memory. Back in the day, I was well entertained. It was fun, but it paled in comparison to the PC version of Battlefield 2. This game is messy and loveless, especially the single player. It was EA's attempt to capitalize on the franchise name, which is sad because the prospect of a Battlefield experience on a console sounds tempting. Unfortunately, this is something that the console players had to wait for another few years. But that's a story for another episode of the history of Battlefield. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join us next time when we will return to the PC. A special thank you goes out to all of our loyal supporters on Patreon, who of course got to see this video first. So, see you guys next time. Until then, have a nice day and as always, goodbye and guten Tag.